Alright guys, so we're going to continue on with our notes in this way for a little bit, and this should help you to complete the lab activity next class and also to continue working on that homework packet that you've got. When we talk about energy and the way it moves through ecosystems, we know that energy starts with the sun if we're talking about photosynthesis, right? And that if we're talking about chemosynthesis, it might start as chemicals, but usually we're talking about the sun. And it's going to flow from the sun through producers to consumers in a one-way stream. Energy never goes backwards, it just goes on to the next consumer. So it all depends on who eats whom. So if we start with our energy here at the sun and we pass that energy on to this producer here represented by these sunflowers, then we might have our first consumer, which would be our roadrunner here for you cartoon fans who eats the sunflower, so energy gets transferred to him. And then you got a second consumer, Wile E. Coyote, who, when eating the roadrunner, if he could ever catch him, would receive the energy in that way. Now what you saw on the last slide is a food chain. A simple series of steps where organisms are transferring energy by eating and being eaten. So every arrow on a food chain represents energy transfer from one organism to the next. Now, this is called a food chain. If you think about a chain, right, it's one link attached to the next, and chains don't generally branch. They just make this one nice path. And that's what we're looking at here. In this situation, you might have a producer like algae. I apologize, that's blurry. I tried to scan it from a book. Then you would have an herbivore, or your first consumer, right here, this flagfish. Then a second consumer, largemouth bass. You'd have a third consumer, an anhinga, which is apparently some sort of bird. I don't really know what that is, but and then an alligator might be our fourth level consumer. And again, these arrows are representing the flow of energy through these organisms. Here's something creepy. I think this is my hair when I scan this in. Weird. But in this situation, we have what we call a primary consumer right here, a secondary consumer, what we call a tertiary consumer right here, tertiary, and what we call a quaternary. This isn't going to fit for me here. Quaternary consumer would be at the fourth level. Okay, and this can keep going and going if we had more and more consumers to look at. Now I asked this question here, what have you eaten today? Because we could put you into a food chain, right? Most everything that we eat is an animal or a plant product. And so we could take something you ate today, say a Mercy cookie, and that's going to be a lot of sugar, which comes from a plant, right? It's going to be butter mixed in there, which comes from dairy products from cows. It's going to have flour mixed in there, which comes from a plant. And so all those things we could put together into a food chain if we wanted to. The reality is, a food chain is not very indicative of what nature is really like, right? There's not just one thing that you eat as a human, or one thing that an alligator eats, like we saw in the last slide, but there are many things that eat each other. And so in nature, a food chain is not a very good picture of what's really going on. So what we often try to do is draw food webs. Food webs, think about a spider web, right? I'm not very good at drawing these, I don't think, but if we have a spider web, right, this is not going well. It branches all over the place, right, versus that one-way chain. This is much more like what we see in nature. Lots of organisms eating lots of other organisms, making a much more complicated image. Like I have here, do you only eat salad? Of course not, right? You have other things that you eat as well. So to be more realistic, we want to look at a food web, which expresses the more complex feeding relationships that actually appear in an ecosystem. So here's a picture of a food web, clearly more complex. And really what we're looking at here is a bunch of overlapping food chains. So if you notice here along this left-hand side, here's the food chain from a couple slides back. But if we wanted to look at that as it actually appears in nature, we're going to include a lot of other things, right? Anhinga don't just eat largemouth bass. They're also going to eat this killifish, they're going to eat this kind of frog, they're going to eat these crayfish. So we want to include all those things. Obviously this can get pretty messy, right? Arrows crossing arrows all over the place. But still, it's just a bunch of food chains. We've got producers, we've got consumers working their way up to a top consumer. Now, in reality, we still often leave a lot of individuals out of a food web. So it's almost impossible if someone were to sit down and try to actually make a food web for the Everglades in Florida, which is what this is supposed to be, the likelihood that they leave somebody out is going to be really high. You could spend a long time picking out different food chains that you see here. Something else that you add here with a food web, you'll notice, is they added in decomposers, right, that are going to break down these plant products here. And so you see those arrows, dotted arrows. Decomposers form that detritus, which is eaten by shrimp and worms and crayfish. But technically, too, all of these guys would be decomposed, right? So we could do dotted arrows from everybody to those decomposers if we wanted to be really consistent. You also notice they throw in a scavenger, like a vulture, who would eat all of these larger predators or larger organisms if they were already dead. Now, as I was just pointing out, you never want to forget decomposers and detritivores. Now, in our classroom, if I ask you to draw a simple food web, say on your test or something like that, I'll usually indicate whether I want you to show me decomposers and detritivores, because those guys can really make it a lot more complex, and a lot of times we don't need that complexity. The fact of the matter is that in nature, this is so true. Most producers die without ever being eaten. Right? Most plants around us are going to die and not be eaten by something. So we need decomposers. Right? Decomposers will turn that dead material into detritus, which gets eaten by detritivores, and brings that energy back into our web or our chain. So if we start here, we've got our dead primary producers. Decomposers like fungi and bacteria will break down that organic matter, and that organic matter goes into the soil. Right? Now, the soil is going to have some of these guys living in it that will eat detritus. The soil also is where the producers live. So as these nutrients are generated by decomposers, they get sent back to the producers, and we start this whole thing over again. Right? So decomposers are extremely necessary as recyclers in our ecosystems. They have to recycle that energy so that we can start over and funnel that energy back into our producers and our consumers. Producers definitely need sunlight, as we've talked about, but they're also going to need those nutrients from the soil that they'll get from a decomposer. If anybody's familiar with composting, or anybody's family composts or has a grandparent that composts, this basically means you put banana peels and other organic matter into your garden, let that break down in the soil, and it's going to add a lot of nutrients to the soil. Now, we also don't want to forget about something called disturbance in food webs. Remember, there is one thing in common between chains, well, there's a couple things, but between chains and these webs, right? And what they have in common is that every little piece of it is interconnected. So if we see a change in one piece of a food web or food chain, one organism, we will see an effect on every other organism in that chain. So let's say we got a real simple one here, right? We got our sun. I'm going to make this just a food chain. We've got some kind of flower here. We've got a bug that eats it. I don't know how I'm going to draw a bug here. Hey, and then we've got a frog that eats that bug. This is probably not going to turn out very well. Okay, that's not that bad. Now, let's say that for some reason a lot of our insects start to die out. The frog is going to experience one of two things, right? If the insects are gone, there's not a food source for the frogs anymore, so they might also decline in numbers. So if the insects start to die off, the frogs have nothing to eat, we might see those frogs start to die as well. The other option, and this is where food webs really come in, is that the frog could change his feeding behavior. Right? If this insect starts to die, then the frog just needs to find a different insect to eat. And that's the way that he can keep avoiding a decline in numbers. Now, the inverse of this can also be true. right? If we see a boom in the number of insects, so we get a whole bunch of insects, then we're going to see an increase in the number of frogs as well. And we call this disturbance. So we'll talk about this in class, and we'll take a look at this in class together to make sure everybody's on together, because this is going to become one of the themes as we move further into our ecology studies. Now, we also want to talk a little bit more about this whole energy flow thing and give you a couple more vocabulary terms. The first one is trophic level. Basically, each step in a food chain or food web is called a trophic level. So whereas so far we've just said, okay, here's the frogs, here's the insects, whatever, each of those is a trophic level. Now, another way that we can illustrate trophic levels, other than drawing an actual food chain or food web, is called an ecological pyramid, where we have different steps on our pyramid, and each one represents a different kind of organism or a different trophic level. Now, you got three types of pyramids: one that shows you energy, one that shows you the amount of mass or matter, and one that shows you the number of organisms. And we call those energy pyramids, biomass pyramids, and pyramids of numbers. We'll start with the energy pyramid. This shows the relative amount of energy available at each trophic level of a food chain or food web. The most important part of an energy pyramid is that you want to remember that transferring energy from one organism to the next is not perfect, ever. Just like everything else in life, it's not an efficient process. So we follow what's called the 10% rule. And that says that only 10% of the energy available at one level is transferred to the next level. So at the starting point here, light or chemical energy, we would say you have 100% energy. But as we move up one step on the pyramid, we only take 10% of that energy with us. And again, only 10% of the energy and 10% of the energy. Ultimately, what we see here is that there is way more energy in producers at the bottom of the pyramid or the bottom of the food chain than there is energy at the top of the food chain. Even though creatures are much more massive here at the top, they are going to have less energy because of this 10% rule. So you might say, hey, where does it go? Well, when all these plants have energy, they're going to have to use some themselves. Right, so they're going to use some of that energy, and they're going to lose some of that energy as heat. Heat, right? Think about that. If you feel yourself, you are warm. If you breathe out, it is warm. And that's heat energy that you lose all the time. So when the plants are finished using some of their energy, losing some of their energy as heat, they give what's left to the next level, which is only about 10%. Now, we can do math problems like this, and you see some of those in that packet that you have. So let's say I've got a producer, I've got consumer 1, I've got consumer 2. If I start out and say, hey, there are 1,000 calories of energy in the producers here, how much energy is in the consumers? You take 10% with each step you make, right? So we make one step from producer to consumer 1, we're going to take 10% of 1,000. So that would be 1,000 times 0.1, and that's going to give us 100. So at the second level, we'd have 100 calories. Then we can do another step. Right, and this time we're going to take 10% of 100. So we would do 100 times, again, 0.1, which is 10%, equals 10. So up here we're only going to have 10 calories. So check those out on your packet. We'll talk about those in class as well, and work on some of the different types of those that we can see. The second type of pyramid is called a biomass pyramid. This shows you the amount of living organic matter at each trophic level. Biomass means like the total weight of the tissue at that level. So as you'll see here, maybe the producers, we've got 5,000 grams of grain. If we were to weigh all those plants, it's 5,000 grams. Chickens, 500 grams. And then this human at the top, 50 grams. Notice again, 10% rule. Right? The amount of biomass that can survive at each level is directly related to the amount of energy available at each level. So this follows a 10% rule as well, and you'll see that a lot on the practice problems. If I say, hey, there's 5,000 grams of grain, how many grams of human could this support? You again would just do the 10% rule, take 10% once, take 10% a second time, and you got your answer. Now, the last kind of pyramid is a little bit different. The last pyramid is called a pyramid of numbers, and this actually shows the relative number of individual organisms at each level. So a literal count of the number of organisms. This is usually similar to biomass, but not always. So in this picture, there's maybe thousands of plants down here. We can count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13 of these little rodents. Looks like there's 6 snakes, and there's 1 hawk. Now notice that this doesn't necessarily follow a 10% rule. It generally gets less and less, so it's still a pyramid, but it might not follow the 10% rule. The other thing you want to notice is that this is the only type of pyramid that can potentially be upside down. And you say, well, how does that happen? Well, let's say that your producer is just 1 tree. Again, we're just counting here. So 1 tree, and then there might be thousands of insects that feed on that tree. So that's got to be a bigger piece, right? If we're drawing this like a pyramid. And then maybe there's hundreds of birds that feed on those insects, and there's 20 snakes that eat the birds. So a lot of times a pyramid of numbers will often look like a diamond of numbers, because you can have one really big producer, but because we're just counting numbers, that's just 1, and so we would just put that 1 there. Alright, so this wraps up the little piece of homework notes. Thanks for paying attention. Hopefully these make sense. Bring with you any questions that you have about this stuff. We'll talk about it in class, and we'll do a lot of practice work with both of these in the coming days. Have a good night.